So this picture on the screen where the father is entirely responsible for productive labor, the mother is entirely responsible for domestic labor, and only the mother and the father are involved in raising children at all. The definition of traditional is, I can leave on my slides. The definition of traditional is something that's long established according to historical norms. So calling this family form traditional implies that it's been around in human history for a very long time. In reality, this form of the human family is really a very unusual one throughout history and cross-culturally, and in fact seems to be relatively novel in human history. So there are two problems in particular with this model of the traditional family. The first is that it has this very extreme sexual division of labor, where men are breadwinners and females are homemakers, and there's no crossover, very rigid gender roles here. It's very common across societies that there is some kind of sexual division of labor. It's unusual for gender roles to look exactly the same for men and women in all societies, but this very rigid division of gender roles is really very unusual. If you actually look at the anthropological and historical evidence, women are typically heavily involved in productive labor across societies. Here's some data put together for different contemporary hunter-gatherer populations worldwide. The table shows the proportion of the diet contributed by men and by women. On average, across these hunter-gatherer populations, men and women are bringing back, roughly speaking, half the calories each to the family. So women are contributing just under half, men just over half. If you look at these different societies, each row is a different society, there is quite a bit of variation between these populations. There are some populations, like the Aceh at the bottom, where women are contributing relatively little to the diet, but then there are some at the top where men are contributing relatively little to the diet. On average, though, both sexes are contributing food to the family. They're both engaging in productive labor. So this idea that women's roles throughout history have been confined to the domestic sphere is simply not true. This is also the case if we look not just at hunter-gatherer societies, but other types of subsistence societies, so agricultural societies as well. This is more data from Barry Hewlett again, showing again the proportion of the diet, in this case just that women are contributing according to a number of societies. Most societies on this table, women are making substantial contributions to subsistence, between about 20 and 60%. So throughout human history, women have contributed productive labor. Their roles have not been entirely domestic. Exclusive male breadwinning seems to have, largely speaking, emerged with the Industrial Revolution. There's kind of a belief that women entered the labor force to some extent during the Industrial Revolution. Factory work made productive labor available to some women. But if you actually look at the data, such as that here from the UK, the proportion of married women working actually declined during the Industrial Revolution. What the Industrial Revolution seems to have done is pushed women into the home where they weren't exclusively before. So this is data from 1851 and 1911, showing that decline of women in the labour force, married women in the labour force in the UK as the Industrial Revolution progressed. The Industrial Revolution also came along with changes in ideology around the family and what motherhood and what childhood is. A good mother became someone who devoted herself exclusively to her husband and children. While motherhood had always involved investing and caring in children, this idea that exclusive childcare was something a good mother did was something that really started to emerge with the Industrial Revolution. Previously, and still in many cultures worldwide, a good mother is someone who goes out to work to feed her children. But more recently in the West, the ideology of a good mother being someone who exclusively devotes herself to her children without going out to work has come to the fore. And in fact, the demographer Alaka Basu says that the Industrial Revolution involved a clamping down on women's autonomy. Women were pushed into the home, pushed into the private sphere where they hadn't been confined before. So one feature of the traditional family that's problematic are these rigid gender roles. The other feature is the idea that the nuclear family is entirely autonomous, that only mothers and fathers are responsible for raising children. Again, throughout human history and cross-culturally, many individuals other than the parents have been involved in raising children. Human reproduction is cooperative. In fact, evolutionary anthropologists like Sarah Hrdy on the screen there now consider one of the defining characteristics of our species to be that we engage in cooperative reproduction. Many individuals beyond the parents are helping parents raise children. It really does take a village to raise a child in our species. Sarah Hrdy's book, Mothers and Others, on the screen there is a really nice introduction to this idea. She puts together a lot of evidence for the case that human reproduction is cooperative. Mothers can't raise children alone. They need a lot of help. One of the first anthropologists to produce some hard evidence on this was Kristen Hawkes, who worked with hunter-gatherers, the Hadzas. There's a typo on that screen, my apologies, that should say Hadza hunter-gatherers. She collected data on what she called hard-working Hadza grandmothers. So Hadza grandmothers, women who were no longer having children of their own, but were now grandmothers, were working really hard to help feed their grandchildren. Something that's now been shown in multiple different kinds of population, and it's not just grandmothers that work hard, but grandfathers too, to feed their children. So these are production curves for Tsimane forager-farmers, a subsistence population that engages both in farming and hunting and gathering. The first graph there shows the production curves for men and women by age, and you can see here clearly that women are being productive. So anything above the line, anything above the zero means that individuals are producing more than they consume, and you can see that throughout adulthood, both men and women are being productive. So women are contributing more calories than they eat in this population. The second graph shows net family production. What this shows is whether the nuclear family, that is mum, dad and kids, can produce enough food entirely to feed themselves according to the mean age of the parent. So during the family life cycle, if you like. And early on in the family life cycle, when the parents are in their 20s and 30s, there's a net loss. So the nuclear family is not producing enough food to feed itself. This means that somebody else has to be feeding the nuclear family. And essentially it's grandparents, grandmothers and grandfathers, you can see from the curve on the left, are being productive. They're producing a surplus of calories into old age. So this graph both shows that the nuclear family a traditional family rather, doesn't have this rigid division of labour sexually, and nuclear families cannot provision themselves. They are having to get help from other individuals. This is also true in contemporary societies, moving away from subsistence societies now. Here is some data on grandparental childcare across different populations in Europe. Even in contemporary Europe, grandparents are giving a lot back to the family. They are engaging a lot of childcare, which can have really important impacts, not just on the children themselves, but also on, for example, mothers' labour force participation. Shireen Kanzi in the UK has looked at the impact of grandparental childcare on women's labour force participation in the UK and finds a causal effect. Women who are getting childcare from the grandparental generation are more likely to re-enter the labour force after having children. So even in contemporary Western societies, grandparents are investing a lot in families. I think the myth of the traditional family in the West was really exposed during COVID. So during COVID, parents really were forced to rely just on themselves to raising children. Not only did they lose childcare from grandparents, but they also lost schools and childcare facilities, which is essentially paid childcare. So in the West, we have this idealization of the traditional family as the nuclear family, but in reality, parents are relying on a network of other individuals, both family, but also schools and paid childcare to help them raise children. It's very, very difficult for parents to both work and raise children, even in contemporary Western societies. And here's some more evidence about the importance globally of mothers and fathers getting support for raising children. So a few years ago, I looked at the associations between the presence of different relatives and child survival in high mortality societies, finding a consistent effect, particularly of the maternal grandmother, on child survival rates. More recently, a systematic review was published, again globally, looking at the evidence for whether grandparents were first engaging in any form of childcare or looking after children, and what influence that might have on their health and development. Again, showing some quite consistent evidence that grandparents are importantly involved in raising children globally throughout the world. So hopefully that very brief anthropological and historical evidence survey demonstrates that the traditional human family is not one that has an extreme division of labour, and is not one where parents raise children alone without any help. So why is the idea that the traditional human family is that isolated nuclear family so prevalent? Why is it so sticky? Why do so many people believe it in the West? Stephanie Kuntz is a historian who published this book back in the 1990s, The Way We Never Were, making exactly this point. The traditional human family is not the isolated nuclear family. She put together a lot of historical evidence suggesting in the US, this idealization of the isolated nuclear family, it really never was a very prominent family form, even in the US. But despite this book having been published some decades ago, we still have this idea that the traditional human family is an isolated nuclear family. Also on the screen there, I've got some data from the Our World in Data website, which has a long-run perspective on female labour force participation in several countries. And although you do see an increase in female labour force participation in recent decades, if you go back further, you see quite substantial proportions of women engaging in the labour force. So really there never was a time when women were exclusively engaged in domestic labour and not receiving any help for raising children. But I think the answer, part of the answer to why that myth is so prevalent is unfortunately academia. I think academics are partly responsible for spreading this myth. Not so much anthropologists and historians. Those disciplines are typically well aware of the variation in the human family throughout history and worldwide. But disciplines such as the evolutionary social sciences, demography, sociology, economics, all of these disciplines tend to have this idea that the traditional family is an isolated nuclear family. I've got a few quotes on the screen to illustrate this. Lovejoy was an evolutionary researcher writing some time ago now, but saying that the nuclear family and human sexual behaviour, division of labour, essentially have their origins long before the dawn of the Pleistocene. He was saying that the isolated nuclear family with extreme rigid gender roles went back millennia, and this is simply not true. But he promoted this in the 1980s. You also have Gary Becker's book, A Treatise on the Family. This is obviously a very well-known, very prominent book used in demography and many other disciplines, and has really influenced academic thinking on the family. In this book, he says that men in the household and women in the labour market is a, quote, deviant division of labour. That's quite a strong term. So these very influential writings that have influenced a lot of academic research on the family, some of them hold very strongly to this norm of extreme sexual division of labour, which again doesn't hold up in reality. On the right-hand side of my screen, at least, you have some quotes from demographers and sociologists, again talking about the decline of the family, talking about the so-called breakdown of the nuclear family in the second half of the 20th century. Samuel Preston, there, a very prominent demographer, again referring to the so-called breakdown of the nuclear family over the second half of the 20th century, referring to it as an earthquake that has shuddered through the American family. So there's this idea repeatedly, again from Sarah McClanahan, whose Diverging Destinies framework is very commonly used in demography. This idea is very prevalent in academia, that there is an extreme sexual division of labour which has always existed until the latter half of the 20th century, and that there wasn't very much help outside of the nuclear family, that the family form was this unbroken nuclear family unit. So academia, I think, is partly responsible for spreading this myth, certain disciplines within academia. And I think part of the reason for this may be that academics come from quite a narrow slice of humanity. I don't know if you know Joe Henrich's and colleagues' work, The Weirdest People in the World. So Joe Henrich coined the acronym WEIRD. He was talking particularly about psychological research, saying that most psychological research comes from weird populations, where WEIRD is an acronym standing for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. I think it's the case that a lot of academics come from these weird sections of society. They tend to come from Western populations, but relatively socially advantaged families, even within Western populations. And socially advantaged families in Western populations happen to be one group of people that does really cling on to this ideal of the isolated nuclear family, because male breadwinning is really only possible in relatively wealthy families. In socially disadvantaged families, it's often the case that it's impossible for a male breadwinner to earn enough to feed a family. However, comfortably off middle-class families can often afford this male breadwinner model. So I think partly the reason why some of these academics are so convinced that male breadwinner nuclear families are traditional is just because it's the family form that they saw around them when they were growing up. But that doesn't mean that's the family form that has always existed throughout all of human history. I think also feeding into this are some social norms around the middle of the 20th century. Several academic disciplines really got going after the Second World War in the latter half of the 20th century. And it was the post-Second World War period that was really the heyday of this idea of the isolated nuclear family. And this was partly because many Western governments actively pushed women out of the workforce in that period after the Second World War. So during the Second World War, as you see the propaganda on the left-hand side of my screen, governments wanted to get women into the workforce because men were away fighting at the front. Towards the end of the war and after the war, they wanted to make sure there were jobs available for returning servicemen. So you see the propaganda on the other side of the screen, really trying to push women out of the workforce and into the home. So I think part of the reason for why some parts of academia have pushed the traditional family model is that they sort of came of age during this period, which was the heyday of the nuclear family, partly because some governments were actively trying to promote propaganda that said women's place is in the home. So hopefully so far I have presented evidence that the traditional family is not one which has an extreme sexual division of labour or that's isolated, and why that myth might have come about, at least partly. The rest of the talk, I want to talk about the consequences of this myth of the traditional family. I've written a paper about this recently if you are interested, but briefly I want to mention the potential health consequences of this myth. I suspect the health consequences of this myth are not good for mothers, fathers, or children. So for fathers, for example, the idea that fathers alone can feed children, can earn enough to completely feed their wives and children, puts a lot of pressure on men. It might lead to, for example, things that are popularly known as toxic masculinity, the idea that men should be self-reliant, that they shouldn't rely on others, that it's masculine ideology to be able to provide for an entire family. This is not something men have done throughout human history. We're a very cooperative species, not just in terms of reproduction, but also in terms of production. Hunter-gatherers often, hunter-gatherers will hunt and gather together. They will cooperate to help feed each other, essentially. So this idea that men should be entirely responsible for feeding their wives and children puts a lot of pressure on men. It may not lead to good health consequences for fathers. For mothers too, this idea that mothers can raise children without any help is putting a lot of pressure on mothers to do something, again, that they haven't done throughout all of human history. There's some research showing that in the UK, new mothers sometimes spend up to 8 hours a day alone. Quite a high proportion of women spend a lot of their day alone with their young children. This is not an ideal situation in which to raise children. If we're a species that has historically relied on cooperative reproduction, mothers need help to raise children. Even something like breastfeeding is a socially learned behaviour. A lot of mothering, parenting is learned from other individuals. So expecting women to do this without help is putting a lot of pressure on women, may contribute to relatively high rates of postnatal depression and other health consequences for new mothers. I also don't think it's going to be good for children. There is sometimes an idea that the traditional family is the best one for children, even if maybe it's not ideal for women who might have to sacrifice working in the labour force in order to look after their children. But there's this very strong ideology that it's best for children to have their mother's devoted attention and no one else's. But again, if we're a species that throughout history has been raised cooperatively, if children aren't interacting with lots of other individuals during their development, they may never develop the social, the emotional, the right cognitive skills that humans need to survive as adults in a very social environment. We're a social species. Isolating children alone with their mothers is probably not good for children's development either. So I would argue that this traditional human family is likely to have adverse health consequences for mothers, fathers, and children. It also feeds into problematic political ideology. So on the screen here is a screenshot from the Incels wiki, and the problematic political ideologies that are very misogynistic. They're sometimes known as the manosphere. There are some very active communities online that are promoting these very misogynistic political ideologies. The manosphere draws a lot of its ideas from the idea that there is this very extreme sexual division of labor in human societies, and that it has always existed. This is the natural state of humans, for men and women to be very different. This is a very problematic political ideology for a number of reasons, not least that it has resulted recently in some fatal terrorist attacks. So I think these ideas of very rigid gender roles have some very negative adverse consequences politically as well as for people's health. But the title of my talk rather, was actually the consequences of this myth for fertility. So that is what the end of the lecture is going to be about. What are the potential consequences of this myth for fertility? The hypothesis here is that fertility is likely to be lower where women have less support for raising children. In societies which idealize the traditional, so-called traditional family, where women are expected to raise children alone without help, may result in relatively low fertility because essentially it's just too hard for women to raise children alone without help. And in societies where women are expected to do that, where there are social norms around women raising kids without very much help, then women and parents may revise down their fertility ideals and fertility may be lower. I have, over the past few years, done some work on fertility, looking at the impact of support on fertility, particularly kin support. This was research funded by the ERC. We looked at a number of different populations using a number of different data sets to look at whether support was associated with fertility. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples here. The first example is work done by Kristen Snopkowski on the screen there, using the Indonesia Family Life Survey. So this is looking at the middle income country and looking at whether grandparental support is associated with fertility in this particular longitudinal data set. This was a good data set to look at this relationship because it's longitudinal, and we have data not just on whether mothers are seeing their parents and parents-in-law very often, but whether they're actually receiving help and what types of help they're getting from their relatives. And the basic hypothesis we were testing here was that the geographical proximity of kin would be positively associated with fertility, but through the provision of help. So through kin, parents and parents-in-law giving actual help to their daughters or their daughters-in-law, and that this help would be associated with higher fertility. And very briefly, reducing some complex analysis down to just one short slide, this is what we found. There was an association, a positive association between the geographic proximity of women's, particularly mothers and mothers-in-law, and their fertility. And this association appeared to act through the provision of help. So this is evidence, in our opinion, that support is associated with higher fertility in this particular context. Women who get more support from their parents and parents-in-law have higher fertility. So that's a middling, slightly higher fertility context. What about lower fertility context? We also looked at this in the UK. Susie Schaffner on the screen there did this particular work. She again used a longitudinal data set, the Millennium Cohort Survey, to look at the provision of support on women's fertility in the UK. Here, the picture was a bit more complicated. There were associations between the receipt of support and fertility, but they weren't always straightforward. one thing we found was that receiving financial support was actually correlated with a lower probability of birth. So this is the exact opposite of what we hypothesized. In this case, financial support is associated with lower fertility. However, receiving emotional support is associated with higher fertility, as we predicted. It was also the case that childcare from families was associated with higher fertility, but only in women of lower socioeconomic position. The opposite seemed to be true for women in higher socioeconomic position, although that association was not very strong, partly because more socially advantaged women didn't get very much childcare help from their families. They tended to use private childcare instead. But childcare from families was common amongst more socially disadvantaged women, and for those women, the receipt of childcare from families was associated with a higher probability of second birth. So it seems that in a lower fertility context, we are still seeing associations between support and fertility, but the picture's a bit more complicated. It also didn't seem to matter where support was coming from. What seemed to matter was the type of support that was offered, whether it was emotional support or financial or practical support like childcare. So in the UK, we wonder if it might be the perception of support which really matters for women's fertility. Women are more likely to go on to have more children if they perceive that they have a supportive network around them. We think, incidentally, that the negative association between financial support and fertility might be because women receiving a lot of financial support are in need of a lot of help, and women who are in need of a lot of help, it's not a good time for them to have another child. So we think that correlation there might be to do with women who are getting a lot of financial support and not in a very good position perhaps to have another child. I should say in this analysis, we also found that the receipt of support is very common in the UK. So going back to the point I made earlier, that women are actually getting a lot of support for child rearing. In the UK, this UK data set, we did see that women were getting a lot of support from different sources to raise their children. Although again, it was patterned by socioeconomic status. I think in the interest of time, I won't spend too much time on that slide, but I'm happy to talk more about it later if anybody is interested. So the last bit of analysis I want to talk about from this ERC project was a review of all of the literature out there on whether the presence of relatives is associated with women's fertility. So the first two analyses where we analysed data sets ourselves to look at this relationship. Here now I'm talking about a review of the existing literature. This was done by Christina Moyer on the screen there. What Christina did was to search through the literature looking for studies which had conducted some kind of statistical analysis associating some indication of the presence of different family members with women's fertility. And we had data on a number of different kinds of family members, including women's siblings and also the presence of their children, other children. But I'm going to concentrate on the parents and parents-in-law here. So this is a review of studies which have looked at whether the presence of women's parents or parents-in-law is associated with their fertility. Overall, the numbers in parentheses are the number of studies that we found on this. We did find quite a few studies looking at this relationship. Overall, what you see is that for parents-in-law, there tends to be quite a consistent pronatal association between the presence of women's in-laws and their fertility, meaning that if the in-laws were present, women were more likely to have higher fertility, measured in various different ways. If you look at the associations between women's parents and fertility, about half of them showed pronatal associations and about half showed negative associations. That's pretty much what you'd expect if there was a completely chance relationship between the presence of parents and women's fertility. Half of them would be positive and half negative. So maybe looking at overall these studies, maybe we can draw some very cautious conclusion that parents-in-law are associated with higher fertility, but parents are not. But in fact, one of the problems with doing this kind of review is that fertility can be measured in several different ways. And what these graphs on the screen now show is the same data, but broken down by fertility outcome. So we had a number of studies that looked at the association between the presence of parents and age at first birth, which is the top graph, several which looked at the presence of parents and length of interbirth intervals, the middle graph, and then the bottom graph is where the fertility outcome is total fertility, total number of live births. And what you actually see if you look at the length of birth intervals, that both parents and parents-in-law seem to be having a reasonably consistent pronatal effect on fertility. So if parents or parents-in-law are nearby, birth intervals are shorter. All else equal, that means fertility will be higher. It's actually with age, oops, sorry, going the wrong way. It's actually with age at first birth that you see slightly different things going on with parents. Again, the presence of parents-in-law is associated, roughly speaking, with a pronatal effect. Parents, if anything, seem to be associated with an antenatal effect. That is, the presence of parents is associated with a delayed age at first birth. Again, all else equal, that would reduce fertility. So this review suggested that it's quite important which fertility outcome that you look at. In terms of overall fertility, I suspect it may be the length of birth intervals that's having more effect. The age at first birth effect, again, there's a lot of literature on the association, why there are associations between the presence of parents and the timing of first birth. And again, I can talk about that in more detail if anybody is interested, but in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to move swiftly on. But broadly, the conclusion from that review is that there is some quite consistent evidence that in some contexts, at least, particularly looking at the length of interbirth intervals, there are reasonably consistent associations between the presence of kin and higher fertility. Those associations are not seen in every population by any means, but they are relatively consistent. The final bit of analysis I want to talk to you about is, again, looking in high income context. And again, it's a review of the literature done by Alice Raybould here on the screen. In this case, we're looking specifically at the support that women get from their male partners and whether this might have an influence on fertility. I'm sure many of you are aware of the gender revolution theory in high-income populations, which suggests that in the traditional human family situation where men are breadwinning and female homemaking, fertility is relatively high because there's a division of labor there that makes it relatively easy for fertility to be reasonably high. That's the graphic on the screen here. And when I say high here, I'm talking about mid-20th century fertility in high-income populations like the West. I don't mean throughout all of human history where high fertility would have been 6 or 7 children. I'm talking about the relatively high fertility that we saw in many Western populations around the middle of the 20th century. And gender revolution theory suggests that during this time period, fertility was relatively high because there was this sexual division of labor that meant it was relatively easy for parents to divide labor and raise children. As women were more likely to move into the labor force during the latter half of the 20th century, fertility then declines because it becomes much more difficult for women to combine childrearing with working in the workplace. So women tend to still be responsible for domestic work, but they're also adding a burden of productive labor too, which reduces fertility. Then the theory is that as we move through time, men should essentially start to do housework. So they're not simply involved in productive labor, but they're helping women out at home by doing more housework. And once men have started to do more housework, then we will see fertility rise again as it becomes easier for couples to manage having children if both are then sharing both productive work and domestic work. Alice Raybould wanted to test this idea, again doing a systematic review of the literature. So she looked through the literature to find studies which has statistically associated some measure of sharing of domestic labor between partners and whether that was associated with fertility. Again, reducing a very complex analysis down to one graph. What she found, broadly speaking, is that there were quite consistent positive associations between more equitable sharing of domestic labor and higher fertility. But there was a lot of complexity there too. It wasn't always the case. Yes, there was a lot of complexity there too, but there was something of a consistent association between more equitable sharing of domestic labor between partners. In other words, women getting more help from their partners to raise their children and higher fertility. Again, we can perhaps draw some cautious conclusions here that when women get more support for having children, their fertility is higher. One of my recommendations here, though, is that we do need to change this terminology. I think there are some well, there's been a lot of debate about gender revolution theory. I think there are a number of issues with it, although there are also some good principles in it, I think. However, I think we do need to move away from referring to male breadwinner nuclear families as traditional in these models. So the idea is that the male breadwinner mid-20th century families were traditional, and we're moving towards more egalitarian families where men and women are sharing productive and household labour. I think it might be better to refer to these two different family forms as having rigid and more flexible gender norms, because the male breadwinner model is not traditional, as I hope I have convinced you during this talk. Overall, my conclusions are: the male breadwinner isolated nuclear family is not a traditional family. We should get rid of that terminology because it is very misleading. In reality, in all kinds of contexts, men and women are cooperating to feed their children and to raise their children. And mothers and fathers are also getting a lot of help with child rearing. The nuclear family in reality is not isolated. The nuclear family gets a lot of support from many other individuals, whether it's family members or whether it's paid childcare or support from various sources. However, we do have this very prevalent myth of the traditional human family, and I think part of the blame for that should be laid at the feet of academics, and I think we need to change our practice and stop referring to the male breadwinner isolated nuclear family as traditional, because it simply isn't. And I do think this is important because I do think there are potentially a number of problematic consequences of the myth of the traditional human family, potentially for lower fertility, but also for adverse health outcomes and to reinforce problematic political ideologies. And on that last point, there are a number of political movements at the moment that are trying to do what is suggested on that screen here, restore the natural order, or at least that's the language that is being used. These movements are conservative political movements that want to push women back into the home because they believe this is so-called restoring the natural order of things, that feminism, that women working in the workplace is a recent modern aberration and it's a bad thing. It's resulting in the breakdown of the human family. This is a political ideology that is not based on fact, because women have always been out there in the workplace. They were never entirely confined to the domestic sphere until relatively recently. But Agenda Europe is an organization of a number of these conservative political movements which are trying to, amongst other things, push women back into the home and restore the natural order, which is not at all the natural order of things. Now, the take-home message is that this is not the traditional human family, and we shouldn't be using that terminology. Thank you very much for your attention.